This day and time. What happened today, years ago.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take your sources, your curiosity, and turn them into, well, hopefully some fascinating insights. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're looking at how just one single day on the calendar, June 23rd, can tell us so much about history. We've got some great sources highlighting this date across 3 different centuries, revealing these really monumental shifts. Our mission today, to unpack these moments from empire building to global cooperation and see how they fundamentally reshape things.
Yeah, it's really quite striking. These events, I mean, they're separated by decades, centuries even, but looking at them together, it gives you this unique view on how power and influence have worked differently throughout history. Get ready for some real aha moments, I think.
Okay, let's dive in. First stop, the 18th century, June 23rd, 1757, the Battle of Plassey. It sounds like just one battle, but the sources, they make it clear it was, well, a lot bigger than that.
Exactly. It was actually a key part of the 7 Years' War, what some historians, call the First Real World War. And at its core, it was this intense rivalry between the British East India Company, the EIC, and France.
Both vying for control in India.
Precisely. And Bengal, the richest province. That was the main stage.
So who were the main players in this drama?
Well, on one side, you had Nawab Siraj-ud-Daulah. He was the young ruler of Bengal, very determined to keep his independence, pushing back against the EIC building forts without permission. On the other side, Robert Clive started as a clerk for the EIC incredibly and rose up to be this very cunning, very decisive general. The sources really paint him that way.
And wasn't there this incident before the battle, the Black Hole of Calcutta? Sounds pretty grim.
It was. After the Nawab took Calcutta in 1756, some British prisoners were held in a really small, cramped space. Tragically, many died. But, and this is important, the sources emphasize that the story, while based on a real event, was massively exaggerated back in Britain.
Propaganda.
Textbook propaganda. Used to whip up public anger and, justify what came next.
Which was Clive's strategy, I assume, not just a straightforward battle.
Not at all. Clive knew his forces were outnumbered. So, direct confrontation, risky. Instead, he went for, let's call it, covert action. Bribery, essentially. He reached out to Mir Jafar, who was actually one of the Nawab's own generals.
Wow. Betrayal from within.
Exactly. Clive, Mir Jafar, and this powerful banking family, the Jagadsets, they conspired. The deal was simple, help the British win, and Mir Jafar gets to be the new Nawab, a puppet ruler.
So June 23rd arrives, the battle itself. How did the forces stack up?
On paper, it looked bad for the British. The Nawab had maybe 30,000 troops, 53 cannons, some French help too, Clive. Only about 3,000 men, mostly Indian sepoys, only 750 Europeans, and just 10 light cannons.
So what happened? How did they possibly win?
2 things. First, a stroke of luck, or maybe misfortune for the Nawab. A sudden heavy downpour. The Nawab's gunpowder and cannons weren't protected. They got soaked. Useless. Clive, however, had covers for his cannons. Kept them dry, kept them firing. That started to break the Nawab's lines.
And the betrayal.
It played out right there. Mir Jafar and his forces, they just stood aside. Didn't engage, watched it happen. Seeing that, the Nawab's army lost heart. Siraj fled. The army just melted away.
And the aftermath. Swift, I imagine.
Very. Siraj was caught, executed. Mir Jafar was put on the throne just as planned, but totally under British control. But the real kicker, the long-term consequence, came a bit later, around 1765. Clive basically forced the Mughal emperor, the nominal ruler of India, to grant the EIC something called Diwani.
Diwani? What's that?
It was the right to collect taxes across Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Huge territory, huge revenues.
So the company gets to collect the taxes?
Exactly. And they used that Indian tax money to fund their own armies, their own administration, their own expansion. This wasn't just a military victory anymore, this was the financial engine. Plassey gave the EIC the money and power to build a British empire in India. A private company, funding an empire with local taxes.
That is staggering. A private company essentially conquering a subcontinent, using its own resources. What does that tell us about power back then in the 18th century?
It really highlights how different things were. You didn't have the kind of nation-state dominance we see later. These chartered companies like the EIC or the Dutch VOC, they were these quasi-state actors. They had armies, they made treaties, and in places where local power was weakening, like the Mughal Empire, a well-organized, financially savvy, and ruthless entity like the EIC could just step into the vacuum. They turned commercial power directly into political and military control. It's a fascinating and frankly quite brutal model of early globalization.
Brutal indeed. Okay, let's jump forward now. From that kind of coercive corporate empire building, we land in the late 19th century, June 23rd, 1894. A completely different kind of global influence is born. The International Olympic Committee, the IOC.
Yes, a total shift in focus. This one starts with a vision, specifically the vision of a Frenchman, Pierre de Coubertin. He was apparently deeply affected by France losing the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. He saw sports, physical education as a way to rebuild national spirit, national character.
But it wasn't just national, right? His idea became much bigger.
Exactly. It evolved into this Olympic ideal. It wasn't just about being athletic. It was about combining physical skill with moral strength, international understanding, peace, even honor. A whole package.
So how did he make this happen? How do you go from an idea to the actual Olympics?
Well, he organized a congress at the Sorbonne in Paris, invited delegates, I think the sources say 78 people from 9 countries, and cleverly the official topic was just amateur sports. Pretty dry stuff, maybe.
A bit of a Trojan horse?
Sort of. He apparently put the really big idea of reviving the ancient Olympic Games right at the end of the agenda, waited for the right moment.
And June 23rd, 1894 was that moment.
That was the day. The delegates at the Congress, they unanimously voted to create the International Olympic Committee, the IOC. A Greek delegate, Dimitrios Vikolis, became the first president. And fittingly, they chose Athens to host the first modern games in 1896.
An inspiring start. But I remember reading the early years weren't exactly smooth sailing.
Oh, far from it. The sources call it a miracle. The movement even survived. The 1896 Athens Games almost didn't happen because Greece was basically broke, financial crisis.
Right.
And then the next 2 games, Paris in 1900 and St. Louis in 1904, they were completely overshadowed. They were just tacked on to these massive world's fairs happening at the same time. Nobody paid much attention to the Olympics themselves.
It sounds like the ideal was immediately tested by reality. How did it survive that rocky start? What kept it going?
I think it speaks to the power of the core idea itself. Even with all those problems, the concept of nations coming together peacefully through sport, it just resonated. It offered something hopeful, in a world that was often full of conflict and tension. And look, the Olympics have faced huge challenges since then. Wars, boycotts, scandals, you name it. But that foundation laid on June 23rd, 1894, those ideals of education, peace, international friendship through sport, they've proven remarkably resilient. It's really the birth certificate of a global cultural movement using soft power.
Soft power, that's a good way to put it. Okay, so we've seen empire by force and finance and influence through ideals and sport. Let's make our final jump. Now we're in the 20th century, mid-Cold War no less, June 23rd, 1961. The Antarctic Treaty comes into effect. This is a totally different model again, right? Pragmatic cooperation.
Absolutely. And you have to understand the context. Before this treaty, Antarctica was, well, it was potentially a powder keg. You had 7 different nations, UK, Argentina, Chile, France, Norway, Australia, New Zealand, all with territorial claims, and many of those claims overlapped. Big time.
Messy.
Very messy. And then you had the superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union. They didn't make formal claims, but they were very active down there doing research, building bases, and they explicitly reserved their right to claim territory later.
So, Cold War tensions potentially extending to the South Pole.
Exactly. There was a real fear it could become another front in the Cold War, maybe even militarized.
But something happened to change that trajectory.
Yes, something really remarkable. It was called the International Geophysical Year, the IGY, spanning 1957 to 1958. It was this huge, coordinated international scientific effort. 67 nations involved, focusing on Earth sciences, and Antarctica was a major, major focus.
Science bringing people together.
In this case, yes. Dozens of research stations were set up. Scientists from different countries, even rival countries, worked together. And crucially, for the sake of the science, the countries involved basically agreed to put their political disputes, their land claims, on hold temporarily.
That cooperation must have built some trust, some momentum.
It absolutely did. It showed that collaboration was possible, even beneficial, despite the political climate. And that spirit flowed directly into negotiating the Antarctic Treaty. It was signed in 1959 and then formally came into force on our key date, June 23, 1961.
Okay, so what did the treaty actually do? What are the core principles?
It's quite elegant, actually.
Yeah.
Article 1 is crystal clear. Antarctica is only for peaceful purposes. No military bases, no weapons testing, nothing military allowed, period. Article 2 guarantees freedom for scientific investigation. Article 3 mandates that scientific plans and results have to be shared openly. Cooperation is built in.
And the tricky part, the land claims. How do they handle that?
That's Article 4, the masterpiece, really. The sources call it the diplomacy of ambiguity. It didn't solve the claims. It didn't recognize anyone's claim, but it didn't deny them either. It just froze them. It said, while this treaty is in force, nobody can make new claims or enlarge existing ones.
So agree to disagree, basically.
Exactly. Agree to disagree on sovereignty, but agree to cooperate on everything else that matters down there. Science, peace. It cleverly sidestepped the roadblock. Then you also have Article V, banning nuclear explosions and radioactive waste disposal. And Article 7 allows any signatory nation to inspect any other nation's stations or activities anytime, anywhere in Antarctica. Total transparency.
That's incredible. So what's the legacy? Antarctica today is unique, isn't it?
Completely unique. It's the only continent on Earth with no native population, no military presence, not governed by any single nation, and dedicated purely to peace and science. And it got even stronger in 1991 with the Madrid Protocol, which added environmental protection rules and banned all mining or resource exploitation until at least 2048.
It really stands out. But the question remains, especially given it happened during the Cold War. How? How did they achieve this consensus when the world was so divided?
That really is the fascinating part, isn't it? You've got the US and USSR, bitter rivals globally, but they both become original signatories to this incredibly cooperative treaty. I think it boils down to a few things. First, the IGY proved cooperation worked and was scientifically valuable to everyone. The scientists built bridges. Second, Antarctica was, frankly, remote and difficult. Maybe nobody saw an immediate strategic military advantage that outweighed the risks of conflict down there. And third, that diplomatic genius of Article 4. By letting everyone keep their claim on paper but making it irrelevant in practice, they found a way forward. It wasn't about winning the sovereignty argument. It was about creating a stable system for science and peace. Pragmatism won.
Pragmatism, ambiguity, science. Quite a combination.
It's a landmark achievement in multilateralism, creating this apolitical zone by just agreeing not to fight over the politics.
So let's try and tie this all together. 3 events, 1 date, June 23rd. We've gone from Plassey.
Right, coercive power, a private company building an empire through force and finance.
To the IOC in 1894.
The power of ideals, internationalism, soft power through culture and sport.
And finally, the Antarctic Treaty in 1961.
Pragmatic cooperation, multilateralism, finding ways to manage shared resources, even amidst deep political division.
It really maps out a dramatic evolution in how global power works, how international relations happen.
Absolutely. Each June 23rd marks a different model, leaving a totally different kind of footprint on the world.
What's so striking when you put them side by side like this is you see this arc. From, sheer force and grabbing resources towards shared values, and then maybe towards these really clever, practical ways to handle complex global problems.
Yeah, managing the global commons, as they say.
This deep dive really shows how a single date can be like a window, letting you see the changing fabric of global governance over time. So, for you, listening, here's something to think about. Building on that last point, how might the lessons from Antarctica, that diplomacy of ambiguity, agreeing to disagree to move forward, how might that apply today? Think about current global hotspots, intractable disputes that block cooperation on, say, climate change or pandemics. Could that Antarctic model offer any clues?
Something to definitely mull over.
Something to think about until our next deep dive.
Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and ring that bell for more History Daily.